What are the biggest wins for teachers that generative AI can provide? How can we help students avoid plagiarism while supporting the creative process? Is it possible for ChatGPT to know too much about us? Welcome back to another episode of the Teachers on Fire podcast, airing live on YouTube every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern. My name is Tim Cavey, and my mission here is to warm your heart, spark your thinking, and ignite your professional practice. Today's Teacher on Fire is Tim Belmont. Tim is a high school technology specialist and language arts teacher who has presented at many of the largest education technology conferences. In the classroom, he elevates student voices through technology-integrated English activities and implements podcasting as a modern public speaking medium, which I am a big fan of. You can follow Tim on LinkedIn, on X at tbelmont.edu, and at his website, timbelmont.com. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Are you, sir, ready to light it up?
I'm ready, Tim. Thanks so much for having me. This is a great way to start a Saturday.
Absolutely. I agree, sir. And you and I have connected here before. It's been quite a while, so welcome back. It's the power of Tim this morning, Tim squared. Right. So I know you are in for a treat, my friends, not on the Tim side of things, but simply because Tim Belmont knows a lot about the topic we're about to jump into. Want to say good morning to Brian coming to us on YouTube. Good morning, Brian. Thanks for joining the broadcast. We've got a lot to get into, as I said, in terms of AI and a lot of the issues surrounding AI. But before we do, would you share a story of adversity that you've faced somewhere in your teaching or professional journey and describe how you overcame it?
Sure. So I've been teaching English this is the end of my 12th year, and I had my role as an English teacher at the start of the pandemic. And one of the low points, I feel like a lot of us could probably say that the height of the COVID pandemic and the start of it was a low point for a lot of us. But for me, from a teaching perspective, when the pandemic started, I had just started a role as a technology specialist in my building, helping teachers use software and hardware in their classrooms. And I think many people may have experienced something similar where I was sort of, I had to dive into the deep end as far as how to deal with teaching during a pandemic. And I remember at first I was extremely, extremely overwhelmed. There were a lot of problems and challenges getting given to me to solve. And then also, there was all of this unease and people were unsure of what was going on in the world. And I remember those first couple of days just trying to figure it out. It felt like an insurmountable task to really get into virtual learning and get through the year. And so that was a low point. But I will say that doing that really taught me about the passion that I have for my role as a technology specialist, helping teachers use technology, running professional development. So although it was a low point, it was something where I learned from the experience and it helped sort of form the values and what I appreciate today, what I do in the classroom.
I often say that growth doesn't happen in the comfort zone, and that was COVID for a lot of people, and it sounds like that was certainly your experience. It pushed you into some new spaces and into some new growth as well. So thanks for sharing that, Tim, and thanks for that glass half full as we look back at COVID and all the trials and tribulations that we endured a few short years ago. Tim, in March, you presented a workshop for educators titled Integrity in AI, Teaching Responsible Use in Classrooms. And that's where I'd like to head next. Love the title because I think so many of the issues that we see when we look at AI, both from an educator and a student perspective, have to do with this idea of integrity. So let's start with this question. In your view, what should concern us most when it comes to bias and misinformation within generative AI tools out there today?
Sure. I do want to mention first that the way that I came up with this session was just I wanted to learn more about AI and the drawbacks of it and the issues that we would face. And I wanted to think about and know about how to talk to my students in the classroom about it and how I could use it in my own teaching as well. So I was really psyched when I was offered to present on this because it was a huge learning experience for me as well. one of the things that I did focus on that, as you mentioned, was the idea of bias and misinformation. And as an English teacher, a big thing that I like to focus on in my English class is just media literacy in general, which is something I've infused into my curriculum for years now. And as many of you know, it's just looking online and evaluating sources, recognizing misinformation and bias in things that we read and things that are shared. And a lot of those same issues come up with artificial intelligence. One of the problems is that a lot of times when we look at something that's developed in a sort of digital environment or something that is made by technology, a lot of times people have this assumption that what's created is objective. It's based on fact, and there's no sort of spin or a personal aspect to it. And with generative AI, because it's really just a conglomeration of a bunch of information put together that's created by humans, it's subjective. It can have the biases that people have normally, and it can have biases based on what information is given to it and how it's trained. And so one of my biggest concerns is just, especially for students, sort of making them understand that we can't just look at the things that AI generates as objective. It's all 100% subjective, and even sometimes to a degree that goes beyond, having a conversation with a person. And then as far as misinformation, as part of media literacy, I ask students to have a very critical eye when looking at information online. But now with generative AI, there are some new aspects to that we have to consider. Not just will these AI generators give us information that is incorrect, which is a very, very possible, but that AI information being misrepresented, or even very real facts, people saying, oh, that's not real, that's AI generated. So now there's this whole other aspect of, with AI in the picture, where misinformation, there are all these other ways that it can be used. So it's about like being vigilant and talking to students about, this is subjective and it can be misrepresented.
When students make a query into one of these large language models and they receive some sort of response, what are their next steps in terms of verifying? What do you advise your students?
So what I usually ask students to do is to do their own research after that, even as simple as doing a Google search and looking at multiple other sources to see what's out there. Because, even when we do an internet search and we look up information, you don't want to use just the first source that pops up. You want to see, is there a consensus on that information? Is it correct? And so you do want to double check with other sources. And if it's a primary source, that's even better. But with AI, it's not even a secondary source. It's like who knows how many steps there is between that primary source. So it's, again, just the same research techniques that, we've been doing with media literacy for years, but it's about taking those extra steps and just verifying the information.
And I want to be careful, Tim, in this conversation. I'm already finding myself being pulled into this very narrow understanding or interpretation of generative AI as an answer box. But we know that it does so much more. It writes poems, it tells directions, the list is pretty long. So I want to be careful about that. But I guess my last question is in terms of the information that it provides, and I know that's the way you took the question as well. So when students receive facts about the world that they live in, verifying, corroborating evidence, these are things that we teach in, as you mentioned, media literacy. On my date night last night, I went on a bit of a rant about. We've heard the term fake news around for ages, and that term is loaded for different reasons. There's also a category of news that I call junk news, which is sort of these very small online publications that are kind of news, but they are run by very agenda-driven or values-driven companies or organizations, generally speaking, and they are not properly verified. They're not held to the same journalistic standards. Their articles are filled with ads. You know the kinds of links that I'm talking about, right?
Totally,
And
yeah.
it's like these articles have headlines and have some appearance of real news. And sadly, I see some of the boomers in my life sort of latching on to some of these stories and thinking they are the same level of journalism as some of the, and I want to be careful here too, because they, the big so-called reputable companies are not perfect either, but they are not, these small junk news organizations are not held to the same standard. So just parsing through all of that is a skill that hopefully we're teaching our students in the news space, and then applying a lot of those same skills into this generative AI as well. Let's keep going. When it comes to generative AI, Tim, I think it's no secret that the biggest fear for many teachers has to do with cheating. So how can we help students avoid plagiarism and avoid just ripping off the results from generative AI?
Sure. And this has been a huge issue. I, as you mentioned, I think anybody who's been in a school this past year, probably there have been numerous discussions about how to deal with this if students are handing in work that's not genuine, if it's created using these generative AI tools. And it's been a learning experience for everybody. And I think that we're still going through the learning experience of how to deal with these things the best. I will say that for me as an English teacher, something that I've been stressing to my students, especially as the year has gone on, I've been really just enforcing to them that you want to care about the process of your work and not just about the product. And so when we're writing something in class, I tell them, we're going to write an essay. We're going to go through all the steps. I want to see your process. I want to hear about your process. I want to see some comments and some feedback. And really putting that process at the forefront, that's sort of like the first line of defense. It lets the students know, this is what I value. And that's not something that generative AI or any other tool that could be used for plagiarism could replicate. And so for me, I've been using some different tools to sort of monitor their work. One tool that I've used is Brisk, which Brisk Teaching is a Chrome extension that it has a bunch of generative AI tools included in it. But the thing that really is appealing to me is they have a tool that can inspect student writing. So I tell students if they're writing an essay, first of all, I try to have them do it in class because I want to be part of that process. But if for some reason I can't, with the inspect writing tool, it gives you a timeline of their writing and it can flag things like things being pasted in. And I tell them, I want you to type everything into the document because I want to see that process. And so you might notice I did not mention AI checkers and things like that. And the reason I didn't say that is because I think the word is getting out now that they just are not reliable. Even every single one that's been out there, I know that ChatGPT has their own one and all these different sort of services. I know that Turnitin has one as well. And it's full of disclaimers about how it's never 100% accurate. And so if schools make policies where those AI checkers are the things that are determining plagiarism, it can really cause friction between the school and the students and the parents. And so I have used them before, but the only time I've really used them is to start a conversation. And really with any of these things, with checking student progress, there's no solution where you can be like, okay, you definitely plagiarized. It's all a conversation starter where it gives you information where you can sit with the student and talk about the process, and then you can sort of go from there. So yeah, it's tough to navigate, but the short answer is there's not just one tool that's like, oh, this tool will prevent any sort of plagiarism in the classroom as far as AI is concerned.
I love the focus that you're putting on process over product. And I think that's a shift that we as teachers need to make, and all of the humanities and other subjects as well, is really putting the focus on how are you getting to that finished product. And that's not easy for teachers to do. Neither of us are saying that's easy, but we need to start to monitor. We need to start to check in more, conference more, or whatever that looks like. And depending on what the learning activity, the learning task is, we need to help students build the skills along the way, because the product itself may not be quite as important or as significant as it used to be. Yeah, to my middle school aged teachers, or pardon me, teachers who work with middle school age students, the feature that is embedded within Google Classroom that allows us to make a copy of every doc. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, Tim, but okay, you know it well. Whatever the learning task is, if you're able to do that, if you're able to make a copy of every doc, and I'll just let listeners know who maybe are not familiar with Google Classroom, we can pop into the Google Docs that each student is working on and sort of pop in and look at their work in real time, whether it's happening in class or at home in an evening. Maybe you just want to see how they're doing. So we have options like that. We have some tools and some capabilities that we didn't used to have. Well, thank you for joining us, Teachers on Fire. If you're getting value from this conversation, give this video a like on whatever platform you happen to be viewing on. Tim, let's move to privacy and security. This is another big area when it comes to AI tools. What should we be thinking about, both as educators and education leaders, when it comes to AI tools in this space?
Sure. I think that right now there's sort of we mentioned this a little bit before we started rolling, but there's been sort of a deluge of AI features being added to tools that teachers already use. There are these new AI tools that are being released, and some of them are marketed towards teachers, some of them are marketed towards students. And I think that the concerns are similar for both teachers and students, but for students, because they're younger, I think it is more consequential with them. One of the biggest things that I always think about, and I talk to students about this, and I talk to teachers as well, is just when you're using these AI tools and you get a text box and you're asked to type in something, a prompt, some information, it's just so important to think about and know where that information is going before it returns back to you with the response. And sometimes it's really, really tough to figure out exactly where it's going. If you go through the privacy policies and the terms of a lot of these websites, it's very convoluted. It mentions a lot of things like third-party services, at which who knows exactly what those are sometimes. And so sometimes we have to sort of like assume that some things are happening. Like, for example, it's possible that using a lot of AI tools, when you submit information and you type it, that tool or another tool, a third-party thing, might be being trained on what you're typing. So one thing I really stress with teachers and students is really to never put personal information into an AI tool, because you don't want the chance to have, your personal data going into that depository of things that this tool might be being trained on. And it is true that there are a lot of tools now where in the privacy policies and in the information, they do explicitly say that it's not being trained on the things you put in. But we also know that a lot of times these policies change. I mean, for example, there was just a big sort of controversy on Twitter about how Adobe changed their terms of services for Photoshop, where it basically said that things that were uploaded to their cloud, it was going to be subject to content moderation. So it would be looking at the things that people were uploading. Now, I don't know if that's been rolled back or if that was some misclarification, but either way, it just shows that sometimes the privacy and security can be a big issue with that. So it's just knowing where the information is going and knowing that basically anything that you type in and really anything posted on the internet could now be put into that training pool for AI. So that's one of the biggest issues that I think about. And I also tell my students to not give any personal information.
Yeah, that's very wise. I just had a terrifying vision of let's say Tim Belmont is inputting all queries of all kinds into into a large language model, and then Tim Cavey over here is searching, tell me more about Tim Belmont, and one of these.
Right, exactly.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Yeah.
I mean, who knows? You know, that's something that it's possible. I know that at least up until a couple months ago, anytime anybody used ChatGPT on their website, on the ChatGPT site, they were automatically opted in to being like helping the training of it. And
Okay.
so, and also it's, you know, a lot of these companies, they don't say, they're not transparent about what their data is, where it's from. And so it's sort of, you just need to, again, I said vigilant before. We just have to make sure that we're on top of that, because it's hard to know exactly where this information is going.
Just before we leave this one, does it bother you if these companies are selling data on the aggregate, on the macro? And what I mean is, I'll just use a random example and say if one of these models is detecting that a very high number of people are asking about campsites and setting up camping gear, they could use that information, right? They could sell it to appropriate companies. So I'm not sure if I should be bothered by that kind of macro level use of data. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, honestly, my first reaction is that probably is already happening. I feel like that happens with everything we do already.
Yeah, that's
true. Even, you know, you go on Instagram and how long you stay on a picture, that affects your advertising profile, and that goes out there. So I don't like it, but it would not surprise me at all if that was happening. Especially, you know, there a lot of people have been saying this, and I really agree with it, is there have been a couple of large language models and even other services that have been free for educators, free for students, things like that. And, you know, the saying is that if it's free, you're the product. And so I sort of assume that that's happening all the time. So it bothers me, but it's almost like it's integrated into, it seems like, everything nowadays.
It's true. It's true. Well, Tim, we don't want to just cast fear and doubt, and hopefully that's not what we're doing here. We're raising critical concerns, and we want to engage as critical thinkers, certainly as education leaders, and we want to help our learners do the same. What are the biggest wins that you've seen? Now, I'll be frank, I haven't used AI tools in my practice a whole lot. Occasionally, I'll refer over to an AI tool. Now, keep in mind, I also work in an elementary world. But what have you seen as the biggest wins for educators so far when it comes to AI tools?
Sure. So I do use some AI tools in my practice. And one of the biggest things that I've found is that it can really help us save time in the classroom, which can help add to the meaningful one-on-one time we can have with students. And this is something where there are a lot of websites and services coming out that are focusing on this, but I really do see the value in it. If there is a task that would have taken a teacher 15 minutes to complete, and then with the help of an AI tool, it takes them 2 minutes. Now in the classroom, they can spend more time with students, or they can plan lessons that have more of that interaction. As an example, I mentioned before that I'm a technology specialist in my school, and we gave an end of year survey about what tools teachers were familiar with throughout the year, because we were going to meet and talk about the tools that we purchased, whether we were getting our money's worth, if there were things that we should consider purchasing for the next year. And so I was given in this Google form a ton of data about what tools people were familiar with, and I was asked to make a little presentation about it. And I was looking at the data, and I was sort of stumped about how to navigate it. It was just a huge spreadsheet. And I ended up taking that information and I brought it to ChatGPT, and it generated the perfect graph for me to present with all of the information. Nice. And that's something where it would have taken me a long time. It probably wouldn't have looked as good, and it freed my time so that I could go work on things that really required 100% of my brain power. So a lot of people are seeing these sort of teacher time saver tools as more like lower level AI tools, but I will say that it helps teachers have more value of their time if that time is freed up.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If these tools that are, I'm talking about tools here that are specifically geared toward teachers, tools like Magic School is the name that I hear the most. If they are actually saving teachers time in quality ways, as you mentioned, sort of there are some low grade products out there, but in ways that will really augment their practice, then I'm all for them. Absolutely. Well, Tim, let's take a couple of minutes. And this is something I don't normally do on a video broadcast, but let's head over to Google Docs, shall we? Here's what we're going to try to do. We're going to do a quick SWOT analysis of AI tools. Tim, as you're adding items, let's read them out loud for the audio only listeners, and let's start populating this thing. So just as they come to you, maybe we'll start with strengths. What are the strengths as you see of the generative AI tools? And we're asking that question in the context of K-12 education.
Gotcha. I do have to apologize real quick. My keyboard is like very clicky and loud, so I just want to give a heads up. So, I mean, because I just mentioned it, I'll mention that it can free up teachers' time.
Yes. Okay. And I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit further for the viewers. Okay. All right. Freeing up teachers' time. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, I do see that with generative AI, and I've used this I've had students think about this, it is very good for brainstorming.
Yes.
Finding starting points when students are working. And I'll recommend, if something like that is happening in school, tools like School AI allows students to use generative AI in a closed, monitored environment. Mm-hmm. And so I have used that before, specifically in my public speaking class, to think of different speech topics. I have students ask questions and get responses from a large language model. But with School AI, I'm able to watch it and see, and we can sort of discuss what they're talking about.
Oh, that's super cool. Mm-hmm. Okay. Tim, we might come back to this box, but let's move over to what are the weaknesses?
Sure. So I'll say the first thing I'll put is bias and misinformation.
Mm-hmm. I'm adding here temptation to skip critical thinking steps. So sort of this idea of let AI do the thinking for me.
If it's cool with you, I'll add one more, which is assuming AI is objective, because we mentioned that thinking like this is the be all end all. And then even I will add to that the fact that people assuming that AI is actually a person that is thinking. Yes. Because, and Tom Mulaney, who is on X, I keep going between calling it X and Twitter because I can't decide, but he's mentioned a lot about this, the idea of this stochastic parrot, the idea that AI is not a thing that is thinking, it's just sort of saying things and it seems like it's thinking. So people sort of getting tricked into thinking, oh, this is a thinking person when it's not.
So we've got the thinking illusion, where students or some users will actually interact with the bot as if it's a person and ask it for personal direction. And maybe in some cases that's appropriate, and that's a whole other conversation. But sometimes it does produce or does deliver inaccurate information.
Sure.
It's just scraping the web, and it's not scraping it in real time. It's pulling from its pool of data that it's already reviewed. Do I have that right, Tim?
Yeah. There was just a news story, and I listened to a podcast about it. Apparently, one company's AI generator, the majority of its information was scraped from Reddit, which is not the most reliable source. And it was,
oh my gosh.
And someone had made it generate like a thing about how you should put glue on your pizza or something.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
which was it's eye-opening. It's like, it really does matter where you get this information from, because it's not all accurate.
All right. Sure. What do you see as the main threats going forward? And we don't like to be pessimists, but we also want to be realists. We want to be prepared.
I mean, I feel like there's probably, when I think about this, there's some overlap with the weaknesses, where some of the weaknesses could lead to threats. Like one thing that I'm thinking of is the fact that because there's bias and misinformation, it can generate mistrust
Right.
in things that we read. If people start misusing AI, we start mistrusting everything, which in a sense, maybe we need to do that anyway, but still that bias and misinformation leads to a big societal issue.
Yeah, it's related to a bigger, almost existential question of what is true. We find ourselves in some frustrating conversations in 2024 that I don't think we would have been in 10 or 20 years ago, where I'm seeing an overlap, I guess, with fake news and that whole conversation.
Yeah, totally.
But it bleeds into AI tools. Okay, I've added students may develop undue reliance on AI tools. So again, we don't want them to miss out on some of the critical thinking skill development that is supposed to be such a major part of school. Something that some people will mention, and I have mixed feelings about this as well, but AI tools may replace a lot of existing jobs.
Sure.
Jobs and career tracks. And overall, I see that as sort of an inevitable product of an industrial, technological society. Some of the jobs around us are going to change, but it's saddening to think that there may be students out there who are training or working through a program toward a career track that will no longer exist. So we need to be aware of that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one, I've read arguments on both sides of that where it's very bad that it's replacing some of these jobs. And then other people are more optimistic saying it's replacing jobs, but then people will have the chance to explore things they're more passionate about. And it's something that I guess we'll see how it plays out in real time over the next couple of years, I guess.
I'm just going to add to your point here. Number one, mistrust or general cynicism. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm just trying to build off of that cynicism about all information in the public. So let's say government institutions, media organizations.
Here in the US, it's an election year. And I know that people are very concerned already about everything that's gonna transpire. So
the spirit of this would be, now that we know that deepfake video exists, can we trust any video? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, there are ways to verify and corroborate video evidence, but you will, I'm sure, have people out there who say, nope, can't trust anything at all now.
Yeah,
which
definitely.
Which is a very sad and serious place to be as a society. Let's move to opportunities. Where do you see things going forward in positive ways in the future? What are some of the possibilities ahead?
So I will say that some people, when they think about generative AI, they think of, and there was an image that's been making the rounds this week about how I want AI to do my laundry and not write poetry because I want to write the poetry while the AI does the laundry or whatever. And I think that if we think about the way that we're using AI, it can allow us to have more time to do the things that only we as humans can do. And also, I think that with AI being able to do some different things, that some people are finding more value in things that are more creative. To give one quick little anecdote, I'm the advisor of the robotics club in our school, and we made a club t-shirt. And we had a couple different designs that we made. And one of the designs that we made, it had an AI generated image on the back that basically met all of the things that students wanted in the shirt. Ultimately, even though the design looked very good, they decided that they didn't want to print it because they wanted it to be something made by a person. So sometimes these tools, it allows us to sort of see what we can do, if that sort of makes sense. It's a bit of a weird way to have an opportunity. But with that free time, AI can do some of those tasks that allow us to do more things that are more human-centric.
Yes, and there's so much overlap here between strengths and opportunities, but let's say that it will continue to pull back the curtains on creative possibilities. It may inspire students in greater ways going forward. More time for creativity. Any other opportunities that you envision in the future? Okay, here's one. And this exists to an extent, but I do wonder about this, and I'll tread carefully here. But I saw this from Sal Khan, who is the founder of the Khan Academy. Real-time tutors. I'm not suggesting that AI tools will ever replace teachers because, as I think it was John Spencer wrote this week, teaching is an intensely human endeavor, and it always will be based on human relationships, I believe. But if we can continue to develop and innovate AI products and tools that have the ability to interact intelligently with students, then imagine working through math problems. Imagine, and I've seen some of this in the video shared by Sal Khan, imagine working through writing as a writing coach. And this would meet learners exactly where they are. We know that in classes of 25 to 30 students, teachers just don't have the capacity to work individually with every student. But I wonder about the possibility in the future for, I'm going to say, real-time tutoring and support.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about something like that, and I know that the discourse about the demo that was released, and also with Khan Academy releasing Khanmigo, their AI tutor, there's been a lot of discussion about the strengths of it, the drawbacks of it. But I think that there are definitely, whether it's lessons learned from that or things that students can gain from it. And I will say, I will add one other thing. And again, I feel like there might be more overlap here with strengths, but a lot of these AI tools can help with differentiation in the classroom. Whether it's, a lot of times teachers, they have to make a lot of different versions of problems, more sort of individualized feedback. And so that way you can sort of have more resources for students and get that feedback also.
So yes, all of that to say, I think these last 2 or 3 points say that teachers may be able to better support learners in the classroom. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great. I've never used a matrix like this before. It's a great way to really dive into a topic.
Absolutely. I think maybe after this conversation, I'll go ahead and tweet it out. You'll probably think of other things that we should add, and I'm sure some of our ex-friends, Education ex-friends or Twitter, as you said earlier, will probably help us. Well, I've taken you way over time, Tim, but I'll try to speed up if you're still game to hang out for a few more minutes.
Let's do it.
All right. Teachers, if you are enjoying this conversation, consider adding the Teachers on Fire YouTube channel to your morning commute. Start your day on fire. Tim, outside of education, tell us about another area of learning for you. What is it that ignites your passions away from the classroom and brings you alive as a human being?
Sure. So one thing that I like to do in my free time is I like to bake. So this is something that I know that a lot of people jumped into making sourdough bread over the pandemic.
Yes.
But I did it. I started like a little bit before that. And so baking has been a big passion of mine. It's something that I wish I was able to do more, but it may not seem like the most creative endeavor, but it can be quite creative. And it also, I mentioned before about focusing on the process and not the product. And especially when you're making certain types of bread, you really have to, you're focusing on the process. It takes a while. And when I'm doing that, I'm really in the moment and I'm present. And so that's part of the reason I love doing it. And then, you get to give bread to people and that makes them happy. So
cool. Share about one personal habit or productivity hack that contributes to your success, Tim, and keeps your fire burning.
One thing that I'll say is I've gotten into the habit over the last year of having a very simple morning routine where I wake up and the first thing I do is I just do a series of stretches. I don't, hop out of bed and run down the stairs and get ready for work. I take some time and I decompress. I make sure that I understand how I'm feeling and being in that moment, and it sort of sets the stage for the day. So that's sort of my productivity hack, just because if I don't do that, I feel a little bit all over the place. So sort of grounding yourself and that starting there is really helpful.
Tell us about someone that we should follow on Education X, Instagram, or LinkedIn, and share why they've been inspiring you lately.
So I'm going to recommend that if you're not already following Katie Fielding, she is on all of those platforms. I know that her handle is KDF on Education X. And I've had the pleasure of presenting with Katie, and she is always sharing resources regarding accessibility and different creativity endeavors. And she's just really worth a follow. And she also has a Substack that she started, and that's an absolutely wonderful read as well. So I recommend checking her out.
We've talked a lot about EdTech and technology today, specifically in the AI field. Is there another app or tool that you currently love using somewhere in your professional practice?
Yeah. So I decided to not go with an AI related tool just for this question. And so I wanted to mention Kami, which is a pretty well-known tool. And the reason why I wanted to mention it is because I used it quite a bit this year in my English classes for annotations, for students to read something and add annotations. And again, going back to that idea of focusing on the process, being able to see students' thoughts as they're reading, that platform made it easy for them to do it, easy for me to give them feedback and look at it. So I'm a huge fan of Kami.
Recommend one book, Tim, one that you've been reading lately, or maybe one of your all-time faves, and tell us why you recommend it.
So the book I'm going to recommend, I've been reading it on and off for a while. I actually have it here. I can hold it up. The name of the book is Make Time for Creativity. The subtitle is Finding Space for Your Most Meaningful Work. This is by Brandon Stousey, and it's basically a workbook about pursuing creative endeavors that's maybe outside of your everyday job. And so it has questions about finding your passion, what you're interested in. And I come back to this if I feel like I'm maybe in a bit of a creative rut, and it gets me brainstorming and thinking about how I can express my creativity.
I love that so much. I find when I'm creative in other spaces, it lights my fire heading back into the classroom. Absolutely.
Totally.
Who is one educator that you would recommend I interview on the Teachers on Fire podcast, Tim?
So I was thinking about this, and the person who jumped up for me is Dee Lanier, who is an educator who I had the privilege of meeting in person at IdeaCon earlier this year in February. And just on a coincidence, because I was going to mention him either way, him and Ken Shelton came out with a book today about sort of the ethics of AI. And they just released it today. And it was a pleasure meeting him. And he always has really interesting, illuminating things to say, him and Ken Shelton. So I'm looking forward to reading his book, and I think that he would be a great person to chat with on the show.
Absolutely. And just for fun, Tim, what are you streaming during your downtime right now? I know the most recent thing I think I saw on Netflix was a crazy documentary about a TikTok cult, but I'm curious to hear what you've been into lately.
So I have to mention two things. Last night, me and my wife watched the movie Hitman on Netflix, which just came out, which was a wild movie, but I enjoyed it. But the thing I've consistently been watching is there's this a small streaming service that has like comedy shows called Dropout TV. And they have this show called Game Changer, which is it's a weekly game show, but every week the rules of the game are totally different. And it's basically designed to throw all of the people off. And it's always like really creative and really wacky and really strange. So it's funny, but also it is like creatively inspiring. So the show is called Game Changer.
That sounds like the kind of show a lot of teachers would resonate with. Tim, this has been fantastic. What are the best ways for Teachers on Fire listening who have resonated with your message and your spaces, your thoughts lately? What are the best ways for them to connect with you and follow your work?
Sure. I'd love to chat on X. My handle is tbelmontedu. I'm on LinkedIn. If you just look up my name, I'm fairly active on there. And then also I have a website, timbelmont.com. It has some posts that I've written and some other ways to get in touch with me. But I'd love to chat with anybody about this topic or about podcasting or about bread or whatever. I'm happy to chat.
So good. Well, thank you, Tim. I have to say, I always enjoy your posts on X. That's where I see you the most. And we've interacted for a few years. It's always special to be able to do it, to be able to engage in real time in conversation. And hopefully we'll be able to meet IRL at some point. But until then, thank you for continuing to inspire my learning and spark my thinking. I know you've done that for me here in this conversation and for my listeners as well. So thank you so much for giving up some of your Saturday morning during a busy season. Teachers on Fire, I'm your host, Tim Cavian. I'm so grateful that you too decided to spend some of your day listening to this podcast. I hope that in some way the content you heard today from Tim Belmont sparked your thinking and ignited your practice. And I'll meet you next week right here on the Teachers on Fire podcast. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Even when you feel slow, you can still go. Even when there's no hope, you can still go. I never answer to no, man, I still go. Go, go.